What's up, everybody? You're watching Model Aviator. I'm Adam, and this week we have a brand new release from HobbyKing, the latest in the Durafly line of warbirds, the Messerschmitt ME-163 Komet version 2. The Komet is a German interceptor aircraft designed for point defense. It's the only operational rocket-powered fighter aircraft in history, and the first piloted aircraft of any type to exceed 1,000 kilometers per hour in level flight. Durafly's version of the Komet runs on the same 2200 4-cell pack that other Durafly warbirds fly on. It has a wingspan of 950 millimeters or 37.4 inches. Its length is 585 millimeters or 23 inches. And its flying weight is 800 to 850 grams or 28 to 30 ounces. And by the way, our example falls right in that range, ready to fly. In World War II, Germany came up with some really interesting technology, much of it far, far ahead of the time, but a lot of it could be considered sketch to say the least, from railguns to tanks that were so heavy they couldn't hardly move without getting stuck in the mud, to things like the ME-163. There's just a lot of funding and a lot of technology that the tactics and the idea looked good on paper, but it really didn't come to fruition and work very well. The 163 had a really interesting mission. First and foremost, it was powered by a rocket motor that once ignited was at full throttle. You had no throttle, that was it. Everything it would do is just what you had, and you ran out of fuel very, very quickly. And in the later versions of the airplane, that rocket fuel, the mixture, was so volatile, the two components, that many of these airplanes and a lot of ground crew were killed just trying to fill these things. And then the idea of getting them off the ground was pretty sketch as well. You had a dolly like you see underneath, and of course this one on the model is wider to make the model work a little better. It was much more narrow on the full-scale airplane, and getting it off the ground was a pretty scary proposition. But once you got the airplane off the ground, you drop the dolly and off you went. And the mission was to accelerate vertically at a very, very rapid rate. And when I say rapid, these airplanes could reach 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes. So they were cooking. They'd make a slashing pass through the bombers if they were placed properly, which a lot of times it's just a matter of timing. They weren't. And they'd be kind of out of position and maybe only make one pass. But on a perfect mission, they had enough fuel to make a gunning pass on the way up, flying through them, turn back around, dive in and make another pass, turn back around, make one more pass coming up. They'd run out of fuel, and they'd make their last pass diving as a glider and then go to land. And the landing was as interesting as the takeoff. They had a retractable skid, and the landing speed, because the airplane was so heavy to be so small, had a very, very high wing loading. They landed at 120 miles an hour in a glide. So quite often, the pilots would flip these things over and be crushed under the weight of the airplane. So it was not a very successful fighter. They, from the research that I did, I think they intercepted and managed to shoot down somewhere along the lines of 9 to possibly 18 at the most Allied aircraft, to 10 shot down by Allied aircraft, but they lost much more than that on the ground in explosions and landing accidents. So you could say this is one of the best Axis airplanes for the Allies of the war. So thankfully, Durafly's model of the ME-163 is not sketch like its full-scale cousin, and we'll take it. Now, an interesting thing about this airplane, a lot of you are going to recognize it. You've seen it before. You know that Durafly has made the 163 before, hence the version 2. Now, the version 1 went through some different iterations that we'll talk about in a second, but one of the things that I have to point out, doing a little research on this airplane, once I knew that we had one coming for review and for the release, I perused the forum on this airplane, and people are still talking about it. There's still people in there active on that forum even now. Even though this airplane has been discontinued for quite some time, there are people that have several examples of them. People love this thing. They've done all kinds of different paint schemes on them, And there are people in there that never got a chance to own one, that are looking for one new in the box, or even one that's not new in the box that somebody's willing to sell, and nobody's giving them up. So I think this re-release is going to excite quite a few people. And this is an airplane that I missed out on as well. I looked at it in both of its iterations in the version 1, and I just never pulled the trigger. I really didn't know what I was missing. Now that I've flown one, this thing is a kick in the pants. It is fun. So the version 1 went through, like I said, a couple of different iterations. It went through 2 paint schemes. It went from having a narrow scale dolly to having a wider dolly like the one that you see here on this version 2. And both iterations of the version 1 had a servo magnet release mechanism that you had to flip a switch to release the dolly. It started out, I think, as a 3S ship, ended up in the second iteration, the red one, the red paint scheme, I think, was a 3 or 4S airplane. So it's an interesting airplane, and it begs the question, now that they've released a version 2, would they change? The version 2 retains some of the more desirable features from the version 1. The first being the wide track dolly, and while that's not exactly scale, it does make the takeoff run much more stable and getting your Komet in the air a lot easier. The other thing it retains is the provision in the tailpipe for an actual model rocket motor, so you can get yourself a few seconds of actual rocket propulsion with your Komet before you take over with the electric motor. The only thing you have to remember if you're doing that is, the first thing, you have to plug the end of the rocket motor up with wax or epoxy or something to keep the charge that would normally deploy your chute from going off inside the airplane. The other thing is, you have to think about weight distribution. If you put a model rocket and a servo mechanism to set it off, you're going to have to add ballast to the front to counter that weight so the airplane flies right, obviously. Now, what did they change in the version 2? Well, the first thing is, this is lighter than the version 1. They've removed some weight a couple of creative ways. The first thing they did is actually remove the servo magnet release mechanism. And the dolly actually just falls away using gravity. The surface that Durafly recommends is smooth grass if you can get it. That is ideal. They don't recommend hard surfaces, as that's way too hard on the model. You can take it off on bumpy grass, but if that's all you have, what could happen is that dolly could actually come out of its channel on a bump before you have flying speed. So if that's the surface you have, they do offer the servo magnet release so that you can get that as an accessory and put it in your model if you need it, if you just don't have really good grass to take off from. The other thing that they did is they actually removed some foam internally and cut a battery channel in it that is the perfect width for a 2200 4-cell, and there's room to move the battery fore and aft so that you can get your balance right, so that's pretty cool. The other thing that they did, and this is something that is really significant, you wouldn't know at first glance, but it really is. They actually have a tail wheel versus the hard tail skid. Now, obviously, it's not a steerable tail wheel. A lot of people are going to be wondering, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, because that wheel rotates, there's less friction than a skid. And that just makes the rudder work much better. You've got more authority, and it's easier to manipulate that rear end with the rudder and keep that nose pointed down the runway on your takeoff run. I had no problem taking this airplane off and just using rudder to counter the torque of that really strong electric motor, and there is a lot of torque, but you've got plenty of authority and a tail section now that, because there's less friction, that you can actually manipulate around and hold this thing straight down the runway. So that is a very, very cool feature. It doesn't seem like much, but when you're using it, it is very, very effective. That's a great change. So let's talk about the condition this thing got to us in and getting it together. Our Durafly Komet came in great condition in spite of FedEx. All the parts were perfect, so we got started on the assembly. Now, you get something Durafly's been doing a lot lately. You get the quick setup guide that has important things like your balance and your throws, and on this airplane, that's key. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the setup. There is a place where you can scan to get the full instruction manual if you so choose, but you don't really need it The parts are very few and it's pretty obvious. You have the fuselage, you have the two wing panels, you have a carbon spar for the wing. You have to put your prop and spinner on, you have to glue on your antenna and your cannon, and you have your vertical, and that is it. You can use welder cement, you can use foam tack, you can use medium CA. I chose to use medium CA just because the wings in particular have a foam tab that goes into a channel in the fuselage, and with the carbon spar there's not a lot of wiggle room, obviously, up and down to get that tab started. It fits very tight. So what I did is just squeeze the end of the tab a bit, squeeze that down, and it gets started, and then you can kind of wiggle it into place. But because it's so tight, which you want, it does tend to want to push the wing panel away from the fuselage. So if you're using something like foam tack, you're going to either have to figure a way to secure that, or you're going to have to hold it until it cures. With medium CA, I just scored the parts, used the CA, and about 20 or 30 seconds later, it was done. So that's why I use that. Same thing with the vertical, although it's much easier to go in. You don't have to do a little bit of wiggling, and it's in there. It does come with some interesting decals. The two decals for the top side to cover up the seam where the wing goes on the fuselage to make that nice smooth line even smoother, they perfectly match the camouflage, which I think is awesome. And there are two for the underside. It comes with another decal. Now you can see what that's half of. These offend some people. Some people like to have a really authentic paint scheme on their ME-163, so it comes with 4 of these. You can put 2 together to make one of what you know this is, and you can have one on either side of the tail, and then you have an authentic paint scheme. If this offends you, then you can just put it in the bin. That is pretty much it for the assembly, so let's get started on the setup. So setting up the ME-163 is not difficult, but it is rather crucial with this model. It's very fast and it's very responsive. So a poor setup can lead to a really poor experience on your first flight. So we're going to give you some helpful hints here and some tips, and hopefully that will get you headed in the right direction. The first thing is balance. The balance range is 85 to 90 millimeters from the leading edge of the wing, where the wing goes into the fuselage. That's with the airplane upside down, battery in it, ready to fly. We started at 90 millimeters. I strongly suggest that you don't go rear of that. I suppose some might want the balance there. We ended up at 85. I like the airplane better there. I don't see any need to go any forward of that. But at 85 millimeters from the leading edge, it really flies well, does everything that I want the airplane to do. And to achieve that, we have our battery all the way forward in the battery tray, and we used a little piece of foam to we glued a piece of foam in the back so that the battery can't slide to the rear. The carbon spar actually keeps the battery from coming out in the rear. You only need to make some provision to keep the battery from popping up in the front. You can use Velcro and that'll work just fine, or you can do what we did and make a little tab on your hatch to hold the top of the battery down. But to achieve that balance point, as you can see here, not only do we have the battery all the way forward, but we have our receiver and our ESC all the way forward, and it required an ounce of ballast up front to get the airplane to that balance range. Now, by the way, ready to fly, even with the ballast, we are still below the highest weight range that the specs say that you'll end up at. So that is pretty good, and there's no adverse effects to that ballast, and you still get to use the battery channel, which is really, really convenient. When it comes to setting up the throws, this is your friend. You do not want to go higher than this. Now, we did, but that's because I'm stupid. But I like to do crazy things with airplanes every now and then just to see if it makes a difference. And I'm used to flying sensitive airplanes, so our high rate is a little higher than this, but our low rate is exactly what this says. And even on the low rate, it is still a very responsive airplane. And in low rate, you can take the airplane off, you can fly it around, do everything you could ever want to do with a Komet for the most part, and land it The only need for the high rate is doing crazy stuff, like we did a pop top with this thing that we'll show you in the flying footage, which is pretty cool, and I needed the high rate to get that kind of movement out of it. But other than that, there's really not a benefit to it. It still rolls really fast, it pitches quickly, it is still very, very nimble, even in the low rate, more so than probably the full-scale airplane. The only other thing that you need to do to prepare your ME-163 and get it ready to go is you will have to sand a lot of the paint off of the part of the dolly that goes in the channel so that it falls free very, very easily. And by easily, I mean that's how easily you need to be able to drop that dolly. And a really helpful tip here, take some canned air with you. You can get to the channel from inside the airplane, and that channel gets plugged up with grass, especially if it's wet, but even if it's not wet, it gets plugged up with stuff that causes friction and will keep that thing from falling free. You just blow it out with your canned air and you're good to go. So with that, we are going to show you our setup page now so you can see our exact setup and the equipment that we used. We're going to show you some awesome flying footage. This thing is a kick in the pants. Check it out, and we'll meet you back here and we'll sum this thing up. We found the easiest way to get a smooth takeoff with the Komet was to hold about half deflection up elevator until it gets ready to fly and eases itself off the dolly. For a lot of this flight, we're at between 50 and 60% throttle cruising. You'll hear little throttle changes like that. That was probably 60% throttle to do that, half Cuban. When you pour the coals to the Komet, it is obvious. It has acceleration and speed in spades, but can do most things at a lower throttle setting. It still has a brisk roll rate even in the low rate. This airplane's nimble in every axis. The Komet's as happy inverted as it is right side up, and it doesn't take a lot of down elevator to hold it. I have to admit, the first time I saw one of these, I thought, man, that looks like a handful. But the truth is, the Komet has a really wide speed envelope, and it's pretty stable at any speed. I used to ride sport bikes. I had a ZX6R, and the Komet reminds me of riding a sport bike. I remember on my ZX6, I could just barely twist my wrist, and I got an instant response that made a difference on the throttle. That's what flying a Komet's like. You move that throttle gimbal just a little bit, and it gives you a response that makes a difference. Here's a scale mission takeoff. Off the ground and climbing like a bat out of hell. On the hunt. In a dive, power off. Between the cooling holes and the channel for the dolly. This thing has an incredibly cool whistle. When your grass runway is bumpy, the servo magnet release prevents this from happening. That was high rate, by the way. We wanted to do a high rate takeoff and show you that with a little bit more deflection on the elevator that we can get the airplane a little bit slower on the landing. So check this out. Here we're showing you a couple of topside passes before we get to the pop top. And here's the pop top. I was amazed at how many rotations we got out of this thing. You just don't expect an ME-163 to be able to do this. We got it in real time and slow-mo. As you can see, the version 2 Komet is a very exhilarating airplane to fly. It is very responsive, and when you want it to be, very, very fast. I think this thing's doing close to 100. So, obviously, it is not an airplane for a beginner. We recommend that you be of intermediate skill level for this airplane. If you've got some experience with something that is a bit sensitive on controls and pretty aerobatic, you're not going to have a problem with this. The speed is something that you can absolutely adjust to. It is a small airplane, so it gets out there quickly at full throttle, but it has a very wide flight envelope, so you can just throttle back, take your time getting used to the blazing speed at full throttle, and you won't have a problem with orientation. Now, one of the things that I really love about this airplane is the fact that it is such a historical piece, and it is so unique. There's only ever been one actually man-operated rocket-powered fighter ever in history, and that is it. So that really makes it a significant historical piece, and it fits a genre much like Durafly's earlier release, the Gloucester Gladiator, and that is the genre of airplanes that are rarely, if ever, modeled. Now, there have been 163s before, but not many, and as far as I know, there's not many, if any, others in production today, and the ones that are, if they're still in production, don't have the scale fidelity that the Durafly has. This is something that is a real conversation piece. When you go to the field with this, take it from me, it gets attention. Most people have never seen one, and they certainly want to see it fly. And when you start zipping around the sky with this thing, people drop what they're doing at the field to watch it. It is an attention getter, and that is pretty cool. Obviously, it's pretty easy to put together for anybody of the skill level to be able to fly this thing. Getting this airplane together is not going to be a problem for you. We highly recommend it. It's something that we're really glad to have in our hangar, and the diminutive size is a real advantage in that respect. It's easy to transport and it's easy to store. Even we have room for one of these, and in our hangar, that's saying something. So, if you would like to add one of these to your hangar, we're going to leave a link in the description where you can go straight to HobbyKing's page and pick one of these up for yourself. We'll also try and link eventually, when we can, the dolly magnet release mechanism and the rocket switch. So yeah, check this thing out. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and in the comments, if you have any questions, please ask. We'll do our best to answer it. If we can't, we'll get a hold of Stuart, ask him, and we'll get back to you. Take care.